Hello. Thank you for allowing me to present these modules for this wonderful program that Ramanujan College is arranging. As I understand, the IQAC and the Teaching Learning Center of Ramanujan College is arranging this FDP, which is quite necessary, and under the auspices of the MHRD, this is indeed a very, very needful program. In this pandemic situation, we have to keep on speaking, we have to keep on discussing, we have to think of research areas, and we have to keep the dialogue on. Otherwise, we will lose time, we will lose the kind of academic excellence that the country is moving towards. So we cannot afford to do so. So without let me start talking about the topic that I have already told you, that this idea of syncretism and the syncretic idea as dealing with theatre. And theatre, not only the praxis, but the way I see it, this entire discussion would be about theatre and theatre studies, because although I will not be dealing with a history of theatre studies or any such thing, but the theoretical aspects that I will be introducing, that I will be reminding you of, I'm sure, would apply to both theatrical practices and to studies of theatre studies. So this idea of syncretism comes from a time which is around independence, I would say. And although let me not become too historical, I am not too obsessed with dates as such, but the region, the temporal region at least, in which it starts is approximately after independence and pre-independence as well, because I will be talking about this. The entire project is starting as an anti-colonial stand. So, but the term syncretic, the theoretical practice, the conscious practice of syncretism is happening sometime after 1947. Now, having said that, we must understand that although India, all parts of India, when I say India, I mean the ancient geographical structure that we have been believing in for a while, and that kind of Indian tradition, particularly going back to the Sanskrit tradition, we have had a very rich inheritance, a very rich tradition. But somewhere along the line, this tradition was lost. Theatre wasn't lost as such, but the theatrical practices changed. As theatre does always, these practices evolved. And when the British came, the theatre paradigm took the British form. And we know the histories, we know how urban, so-called civilized theatre was essentially for the British, for the entertainment of the colonial rulers, and they wanted to have distractions which went beyond hunting tigers and whatnot. So these clubs, these parties and all those, and they started having these theatrical practices in rather following the Western model. And that is the convention that early modern Indian theatre also adopted. Theatre, of course, has to evolve. At no point of time would I say that we need to go back to an earlier tradition or any such thing. And that is the whole point of having this syncretic idea around. It should be an amalgamation of forms which allows all the traditions that we have inherited over the years to coexist, to come together and create a truly modern form. Experiments are happening, successes are there. There are plenty of brilliant theatre practitioners all over the nation who are dealing with this. I will be talking about them later on in my discussions. And historically, I will probably mention a few who are dealing with this now, right? But I will also talk about those who started this whole thing, this entire theoretical perspective, the entire conscious project of having a syncretic theatre. Now, before I move forward to that, what I think I need to do is to talk about this Western paradigm for a little while. Today I will try to talk about this paradigm, and I will try to talk about syncretism as such, and then I will move on to some other theoretical forms in the second module. And in the third module I will be talking about these practitioners and how their theatre can be seen, how their theatre can be looked at, experienced, and so on. But today, let me talk about this. Let me start by talking about this Western paradigm. Now, the primary problem with the Western paradigm is that it needs a very concrete kind of a conflict. If you think about any and all European theatre theories, early or even ancient European theatre theories, you will see there is this idea of a conflict, and the conflict always needs the other. There has to be the other. Otherwise, there will be no conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. And this antagonist has to be the other. And this otherization, the concept of otherization comes from this. Some form of the other would be there. Right? It can be good and bad, it can be good and evil, let's say, or it can be gods and men, and women, of course. So, and it can be these conflicts, and these conflicts would be resolved by either a curative principle or by the removal of the problematic other. Sometimes death, sometimes some kind of deus ex machina or deus ex machina, and something like that would be necessary to reintroduce the status quo. And this is the point, that this otherization would be temporary. What would happen is that the establishment would be re-established. That is the idea of status quo, whether it's the classical idea of tragedy or the classical idea of comedy. The status quo has to come back. And of course, also the fact And even if you think about modern realistic theatre or modern naturalistic theatre, the entire idea is an idea of separation. You separate the stage reality from the reality that the audience is in, so-called real reality, if you believe in that sort of thing. So this distinction, the fact that it is understood that the stage is but an imitation of life, is something that is distancing the stage. It is creating a completely different presence other than the presence of the audience. Of course, this has been challenged. We know the Brechtian principles, we know theatre of cruelty, we know different forms, different experimentations, but those have not become entirely popular, and what we have had is this establishment, let me call it pro-establishment kind of theatre. And this status quo speaks of believing in an absolute set of values. The absolute set of values. This is where the problem is. It does not allow challenges. It does not allow the other to have their voice properly heard. If they are violently villainous, you can have tragic consequences. You can admire them, but you are reminded that the end would be tragic. If it is somewhat rational, if it is somewhat problematic in the sense that it cannot be otherized that easily, then you ridicule it. You turn it into comedy. You turn it into something like 12th Night, where Malvolio could be painted in absolutely ridiculous colors. And the whole idea of Puritanism would be chucked out, rejected. I am not saying that we should support Puritanism, but as an example, I am telling you that the other voice is not given due space. So this otherization, if you think about all the texts in the history of theatre, if you think about, well, beginning from Oedipus Rex, and we know Oedipus personally has this ego, hubris, but otherwise, is he really at fault? Does he have an option? But the gods will have their absolute power, and you cannot challenge the gods. So challenge is not acceptable. There can be no dialogue, there can be no exchange. Whatever is fated will happen. And even if you think about later texts which are more mellowed, Elizabethan texts, for instance, something like Macbeth. Macbeth offers a great challenge. The history is problematic because if we look at history, Macbeth, the Red King, ruled brilliantly for a long period of time, for about 10 years. And after that, he became a problem. But when we have the Elizabethan so-called history play, it's a romantic tragedy, but still it's a history play. When we have that play, we have this clear division. We have this clear idea that Macbeth cannot be allowed to have his voice heard. Duncan might be a worthless king, but you cannot do to Duncan what Macbeth is doing to Duncan. So on and so forth. And if you look at Peter Pan, if you look at a play like Look Back in Anger, once again the voice is heard, but the voice at the end of the day is not a challenging voice. It's a praying voice. It's a voice that is demanding without demanding anything. It's just demanding to be heard. So the power, the establishment remains absolute. So the values that are there, that are prevalent, are given absolute status. And the audience also, going back to my earlier point, I guess, the audience also does not really have a role to play. In this paradigm, the audience does not get to have any exchanges with the stage, because the picture frame stage is the picture frame stage. The only wall that the play can break, the theatre people can break, is the fourth wall. The other three walls are rigid. They are absolute. Right. Unlike the Jatra tradition, the folk theatre traditions that we have in India, or even in Shakespearean days, that was not as absolute as we have turned them into. And looking at these issues, we see the audience as observers. They are never participators. They are never participants. They observe. They are told to think something. Think of Shavian theatre, for instance. The thesis plays. Shaw will tell you what to think. Shaw is not going to give you an option. He is just going to tell you this is right, this is wrong. The older notions were wrong. Whatever I am saying is right. So that's the kind of absolute value system, that's the kind of absolute propositions that I am talking about. And of course, along with the star system, the celebrity culture that we live in, that other distance is created. Whatever a celebrity tells you has to be gospel. You cannot challenge if a celebrity comes and tells you that this toothpaste is the best. You have to believe it. And if that celebrity comes and tells you that these are the issues that you should believe in, and you do believe in that. Now, that is filmic culture in our country. But even stage can have that kind of impact. Theatre people can have that kind of impact. So this distinction, and all these came with our colonial masters. They created this because, as I said, they needed entertainment. These masters constructed this whole idea, and our theatricians, our theatre practitioners, borrowed from them, because that was the prevalent idea. That is how they could present certain issues to people, to particularly an urban kind of an audience. So that was necessary. And this, what these colonial masters also did was that they very, very consciously replaced the indigenous traditions. They not only replaced, but they rejected, they discarded the indigenous traditions. As we know, this colonial project of civilizing was very much functional, and they did not bother to understand what kind of civilization they were negotiating with. To them, everything other than theirs was uncivilized. And as you know, the term native has become a hugely problematic term. I mean, there is no problem etymologically with the term native, but now if you call somebody a native in a post-colonial state, I would not guarantee the safety of your health. So, this is the space in which we have the beginning of Indian theatre, and of course, this is a very, very gross kind of a simplification of an issue which is far more complicated. I mean, at the end of the module, I will give you a reading list, a kind of a bibliography, and they will in much more detail deal with the concepts that I am essentially throwing at you. So, and what I'll do is just I will give you a quotation from Peter Brook, because you know Peter Brook, when he created his Mahabharata, the Mahabharata, he looked at Indian culture, and he had a lot of things to say. Just I will give you one small quotation here. This quotation wonderfully sums up a kind of a Western understanding of the Eastern Indian kind of a culture. But as I said, for a long time, the Western gaze was looking at everything Indian as uncivilized, as exotic, as things which were definitely the other. They were the other. The otherness is beyond doubt. So this came with the colonial project of civilization, as I have already said, and along with this project came Western education as well. So when we are looking at the early exponents of Indian theatre who were writing in Indian languages or writing in English or any such thing, we see that they were also educated in the Western way. The entire Western kind of philosophy that was imposed. Imposition is perhaps the word, although there is this happy amalgamation. I mean, the modernization of India, as is theorized by a lot of historians and sociologists, happened with the coming of Indian colonization and the establishment of Western education. So India apparently opened up to the world, and a new tradition was instituted. So a new tradition was instituted, which was not really looking at the older ones. There were parallel presences for a very long time, but for our concern, this is a very different discussion once again. For our concern, we have these people who are trained in the Western ways of thought, particularly vis-a-vis theatre, but they were also looking at Indian traditions, Indian stories. They were also looking at a kind of an Oriental approach, which created the first instances of syncretic theatre. Even when early playwrights like Bengali playwrights like Girish Ghosh were writing, they were adapting Western theatre. They were adapting Macbeth. There were a lot of Shakespearean adaptations at that point of time, and they were also presenting Indian stories, but they were presenting them through the Western model mostly. There is a very interesting history of the establishment of star theatre. If you are interested, you can look at it, the establishment of star theatre in Kolkata and how everything happened. So a theatre space, a dedicated space was required, the old Minerva theatre, and these theatres in all over the country, in fact, these old theatres, they became very significant in the development of theatre in India and in the development of a westernized theatre in India. But it's not as if the old traditions were forgotten. They survived through folk, they survived through dance forms, and you know all this. I mean, I need not get into this as such. So these folk ideas were quite often appropriated, and so on and so forth. So what happened was, even the beginning of theatre studies, at least not at that point of time, it came much later, but perception of theatre, reception of theatre was also modelled on Western principles. When you are watching a folk kind of an element, you are not thinking of the highbrow idea of theatre. So reading theatre was also something that was dominated by Western principles. And as we know, that theatre is something that is deeply involved in the contemporary. There are classics. I mean, we still talk about Western ancient classics, the Greek theatres, we talk about Shakespeare, we talk about Marlowe, we talk about even if you are a student of literature of Europe, then you talk about a lot of other playwrights as well. But if you compare them to, it's because you are interested in the history of theatre. But if you are a common person, if you are a layman, it's very wrong to say common person, that it sounds very judgmental. But if you are a layman as far as theatre studies are concerned, then you are looking at something contemporary. You are looking for something contemporary. You are not really bothered about the history of English literature or the history of Western literature or American literature, or for that matter, the history of indigenous literature. You are not entirely interested in. What you want is an art work which would connect to you. And even when you are looking at Shakespeare, you are thinking of what we call universal ideas. We are thinking of all these ideas that have survived over time. So we are thinking in those terms. So, and the other thing that theatre does, and this is why theatre became such a huge instrument in the anti-colonial project, and later on in the project that would be addressing the neo-colonial, neo-hegemonic ideas which have been there, which have been plaguing our country for a long time now, in fact. So, and these ideas would be born, and these ideas would be quite political. And these political ideas would be immediate ideas. So theatre has this responsibility of being immediate. Because you do not just go to see a theatre which is merely a classic. You see a play only when it, as I said, connects to you. Because we live in a country which has this wonderful variety. We need to have this idea of syncretism, not only from the West, that's what I was going to say, but amongst ourselves as well, and which is happening slowly, but it is happening. But what the Western paradigm had done was that it could work as an umbrella figure. And the different syncretisms that we had, they, although there is no central syncretism as well, we have regional syncretisms. But still, the projects that they had, sometimes they could become greater. They could take on national proportions. And it could happen because the Western form was amalgamated with something that was Indian, that was indigenous. And being indigenous, being truly indigenous, it would appeal to a larger Indian audience, like when one is addressing the Indian epics. Then one can connect the entire nation. And through syncretism, through theatre, you immediately understand I am talking about texts like Girish Karnad's Agnivarsha and such texts, and I will be talking about them in a later module. And so the entire project becomes this connector of sorts, the entire syncretic project. And it is not really a concrete attempt to, kind of unify the nation or something as grand as that, because we still have that salad bowl kind of a culture that people speak about, and we celebrate that culture. But in certain ways, syncretism can break certain boundaries. Now I'm going to stop this module at this point of time. I will see you in the next.